Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of There's a Will. We'll be focusing on the Ukrainian war. With me in the studio is Phil Goss, who is fresh back from a trip, two trips over. Interesting trips to Lviv.
Yes.
With rather some interesting journalists and noted journalists. Also Nicholas Richardson, of course, in the studio, who will be telling us the latest on NATO and giving us his views in that area where he's very well informed. We have also on Skype Jonathan Roy, who has recently been to the border. I happen to know a lot about that trip, but I'm going to let him tell the story as he sees it. And of course, our correspondent in the Baltics, Harold von Kursk. Harold, how are things? Let's start with you. Give us something a little fresh, a fresh view from up there, please.
Yes, well, there's a certain amount of high anxiety, as one can imagine here, because there are some observers who believe that once Putin is done with Ukraine, done, of course, being a relative term, because I think it'll be a type of ongoing Afghanistan-style quagmire for a number of years. In Estonia, we had an interesting situation where American forces were doing maneuvers in the eastern part of the country. They were demonstrating the use of Javelin missiles on armed troop transport carriers. And so Estonia is getting ready, in effect, at least to offer some marginal defense in case of any type of attack. But essentially, it's preparing for what is, one would hope, is an impossible scenario that Russia would proceed to try to annex the Baltics. But nonetheless, Estonia is preparing, and certainly from everything that Biden and the rest of the European NATO nations have said, any encroachment on 1 inch of Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, or Polish territory would mean that NATO would use its full force against Russian troops, and I think quickly crush Russian forces in any land war.
Yes, in any conventional war, right? That's the view. That's the view from up there. Are people worried about the situation? Are they talking about it in the streets, in the cafes,
yeah, they're
in the
talking
shops?
about it. I mean, it's not, let's say, an active worry, but it's something which is, occupying a certain amount of RAM space in the subconscious. And naturally, Estonia has bitter memories of Russian occupation until independence in 91. So nobody is, let's say, calm these days. At least COVID is off the news. So the only thing people have to worry about is World War III and a Russian invasion.
Good point. Thank you, Harold, for that report. I want to go over to Nicholas now. Nicholas, could you tell us the latest on NATO? You did a program recently. It was shown on another station here, the TVP 24. Can you tell us something about what's going on with NATO?
The main NATO consideration is that it has always been, what can they do without allegedly or without the fear of provoking Russia more. And the one story which is probably a lot of people have been following in the news this week was the suggestion that Poland would surrender its MiG-29 fighters. The advantage of the MiG-29 fighter is it's a former Soviet fighter, so Ukrainian pilots are already trained to fly it with a bit of alteration, in return for which the Americans, another NATO member, of course, would supply Poland with F-15s. This would probably be better done in private because, of course, it all fell apart.
I'm glad you brought this up.
Largely because the Poles were worried that if they sent these, or if they allowed these planes to be used by the Ukrainians, then somehow this would provoke Putin more and would bring Poland into the war. I mean, I think that's unlikely, given the fact that the United States and the United Kingdom are quite openly supplying advanced weaponry to Ukrainians already. And I don't think, Putin is a bully. He's already bombing hospitals. I don't think there's much more to be provoked, essentially. And I'm sure it's not beyond the wit of man or the wit of NATO to do something to actually get these jets, if they're useful to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think is actually stopping them?
People are paranoid. He's a bully, and they're worried about World War III. I mean, the point is, and it's a point really following on from Harold, if NATO is saying, oh, well, we can't act because it might provoke Putin has threatened to use his nuclear weapons, then it renders NATO pointless.
Well, we have nuclear weapons
We have nuclear weapons too. Yeah. He's a bully. I mean, otherwise, we're going to get to the stage he's going to, assuming he will, and it's by no means clear that he actually will succeed because things are not going very well for the Russians by their standards. He will then go to Moldova, then he will go to the Baltic states. And what are we going to? We're going to see in a year's time President Biden, if he's still alive, on the television saying, although Article 5 of NATO says we have to respond to this Russian invasion of Estonia, we don't think a small country is worth nuclear war for, so we're going to sort of compromise. That is not, I hope that's not what will happen. But it's all about willpower. He's a bully, and we just have to stand up to him. And it's easy for me to say so from relative safety of Warsaw. But the reality is he's bluffing, and he's a bully, and he can be stopped. I mean, he's already turning on his own people. You'll have seen that a number of FSB senior people have been arrested or confined to their homes. They're losing.
Can you expand on that, please?
Well, the FSB, of course, the person who's been arrested is the man who was head of the intelligence bureau. And Putin is clearly feeling that the intelligence he received about Ukraine was inaccurate. Therefore, his troops are not doing as well as they should. I'm sort of shortening it, obviously. Therefore, his troops are not doing as well as they should. Therefore, somebody has to be blamed. The other school of thought is, in actual fact, the FSB had very good intelligence, but they were all frightened of telling Putin the truth, which was that Ukraine would actually put up a very stern resistance. And in these sort of...
is that echo chamber
Yes,
around?
Because in these sort of totalitarian regimes, the people are frightened of telling the leader the truth. So they tell the leader what the leader wishes to hear, which is, in this case, the Ukrainians, a useless bunch of sort of guerrillas. We'll get through them in a week. And, of course, they're a very skilled fighting force. They're able to use very well the weapon that they have received from the United States and the NATO training. So they're doing remarkably well, given the situation. For NATO to sort of stand carrying, oh, this man has threatened to use nuclear weapons, let's sort of all panic, is ridiculous. We should say, look, you're bombing hospitals, you're bombing civilians. We're not actually going to go to war with you, but we're now going to start supporting the Ukrainians because we cannot stand by and watch women and children and other civilians be slaughtered indiscriminately because you are too evil to put a stop to it.
It's hard to find the right word. I see you struggling.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right word, evil. Because
evil doesn't even seem...
No.
Seems strong enough.
And I think the other fear that NATO has, and everybody has, is that because if you like, the conventional approach, which the Russians were no doubt hoping, which was a quick move into Ukraine, occupy territory, remove the president, occupy Kiev, has not worked. The Russians will get more and more cross and more agitated and will start using indiscriminate heavy bombing or artillery shells and just start a reign of terror.
If not the main nukes, there's been this idea of what I call the thermobarbaric bombs. Thermobarbaric.
Yeah, there were also reports that there had been that the Russians had bombed a target in Belarus. Which some suspect is a way of a sort of false flag operation to blame the Ukrainians to get the Belarusians on side, which would then mean that Ukraine can be even more at risk from the north. I mean, so there's a lot going on.
The Belarusian people are not on board with this.
Well, no,
you can be sure the soldiers are not on board with it.
Well, exactly. A lot of Russian soldiers appear not to be on board with it.
Appear not to be.
And I'm sure, in as much as we can tell these things, there's a lot of opposition within the regime in Russia now. Yeah. But of course, in those totalitarian regimes are set up in such a way that it's actually very hard for any opposition ever to have leverage. They've all got to be really sure at the moment they decide to do something that everybody's united in doing it.
Yeah.
But in the press now in Russia, or on television at least, there have been beginnings of some, which is remarkable for a state-controlled media. There have been some beginnings, people questioning whether this is the right way to go. The Ukrainians are our brothers. They're not stupid people. They're good fighters.
Well, it's interesting. It also shows that the former president, before the president now, came to NATO and said, look, you need to pay your proper amount, which is, I don't know, was it 2% of GDP or something like that? Yeah, is that right? I think
It is.
yeah,
Well, the
yeah.
NATO, I mean,
Yeah.
spend as much as you like. The NATO target is at least 2% of GDP.
Right, but now the Germans want to double that, which
Yeah.
is interesting, and that's a whole other subject. I'm sure you know a lot about that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the tragedy is that
Yeah.
Western Europe has, the European members of NATO, most of them have for a long time relied on the Americans. So we don't have to spend money on defence because the Americans will always come and rescue us.
Well, that's it.
Donald Trump was the first to sort of question this, which has resulted in people beginning to wake up. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been an even bigger wake-up call, particularly if countries like Germany, whose armed forces had fallen into a terrible state.
They have, yes. And also interesting what Switzerland did all this time. I just want to make the point that people are taking, the Japanese too, or countries are taking Switzerland, Germany.
Even Sweden.
And Japan, unprecedented steps.
Sweden, which has not supplied military hardware to anybody since 1939.
Yeah.
You have to question the sanity of a
Noted
man
for their
who
neutrality.
is able to unite Sweden
incredible.
and Switzerland against him.
So
It's
in many
extraordinary.
ways, it's not that original a thought, but perhaps it's worth stating again that Putin has actually increased the very thing that he wanted to stop.
Yeah, and of course the economic sanctions are beginning to have an
Yeah.
effect. For example, I mean, the Russian central bank has now said that if you receive money in Russia from foreigners in foreign currency, you may only withdraw that from the bank in rubles. They're now getting really desperate.
Yeah.
At least half the foreign currency reserves are outside Russia, so they're not available to the Russians anymore.
Yeah.
So the whole thing, I think, is not what Putin was expecting.
Yeah, and just to come back to those planes, what do you? How should? I think now that they've disavowed it, now they can black ops those planes into.
Well, they should just announce.
Harold's got something
Yeah,
to
but
say.
they should just very quickly. They should just announce that the planes are for sale. They should be bought by some shady international arms
Yes.
dealer and then sold to Ukraine.
Right.
And everybody's happy.
That's what I said at the beginning. Why don't they just buy them on the Lend-Lease and it's through? Harold, you had
The
something.
whole issue of the MiGs, in a way, is an irrelevancy because it would take a while for the Ukrainians to properly be able to fly them. And also, Russia is still dominating the air. What the war as it is will be won, or at least defended, on the basis of the number of Stingers, the number of Javelin missiles that the Ukrainians can bring, because these are effective as ground-to-air systems to destroy helicopters and planes which are on low-level bombing or strafing or bombing mission. But what the Ukrainians really want are the S-300 system, which is a Soviet or Russian system, which they are trained to operate. The S-300 is what I believe brought down the Dutch plane many years ago, I think during the Crimean War. And so they need the S-300s, and also they need the Avenger system, which allows the Stinger missiles to be mounted on mobile vehicles. I mean, these are things which will tip the balance. And also, Ukrainians could benefit from the installation of counter-battery radar systems. Now, these systems identify where a rocket has been launched, the kind that are destroying the Ukrainian cities, which is a form of terror weapon. And so this is what the Ukrainians need most of all, and I imagine they are receiving all these types of equipment as covertly as possible.
Thank you, Harold. Comments well worth making and hearing. Thanks for that. Makes my job easier. Jonathan, I want to come to some personal stories. And we have a lot of personal stories because obviously we being in Warsaw, which is the central receiving place for refugees once they cross through the border. I believe there are now 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees here.
1.6.
In Poland?
In Poland.
1.6 million as of this recording. It'll be on TV tomorrow. This is Saturday, the 12th of March, right? Yeah. And we have just been inundated with people here over the last 2 weeks. It's quite extraordinary the way people are behaving. And I want to introduce Jonathan, if you could just tell us briefly your story about bringing some people up to Warsaw. And then we'll get to Phil.
Sure, and I think that then we'll maybe end on the responses from people and kind of trying to clarify where things might need to go and how people need to be helped out, and some questions we have ourselves still. But yeah, so as you say, we just went down to Przemysl.
Yeah. And Medica, the border
missing some
point.
vowels.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll bring some over from the other side. But to see what's going on, to bring people back here, and obviously to do some journalism and try to improve our ability to create awareness, and at the same time really figure out, I have so many people both in the United States and people internationally, friends, former colleagues and corporations even, that are like, okay, well, how are you guys doing and what is happening, and where can we give money? So part of this trip down there, in addition to getting people back away from the border and towards their destinations, where they had them or not, but at least away from the congestion down there, was also to really explore, interview people if we could, see what the situation on the ground was, so that we could really get some initial ideas.
What was your impression of the way things were moving down there?
I would say that a lot of what we saw on the surface looked kind of squalid, but at the same time, we delved in further and you realize that the actual, the processing of people was quite seamless, it seemed.
Efficient, perhaps.
Very
yeah.
efficient,
Yeah.
and the buses would roll up to the line of people, and there were soldiers, police, firemen, everyone involved, medics everywhere, medical tents.
This is right on the border, as well as there's receiving station and Przemysl.
I was saying that we went to Medica, actually, right on the border.
Medica's right on the border, and there were a lot of people walking through. Right?
Yes, I mean, there was, I think we were there for a few hours, and we saw we weren't up at that spot the whole time, but I think maybe like one or two cars came through from the Ukrainian side. A whole line to the horizon, basically, of cars waiting to get in to Ukraine at the car post. Yeah. So we then went down and focused on the pedestrian walk-in lane, if you will, and that's was surrounded by lots of media, lots of cameras, and also tables giving out food and water and things like that. There were French there, Italian news crews. I mean, we saw on the whole trip. I think we saw most of the EU's license plates almost in parking lots, in reception centers, and up there.
And you brought some people back. You had a van with you. You brought some people back. How many people did you get out?
Well,
it's mostly women and children. There are some older people.
But yes, of course, there's no Ukrainian men between the ages of 17 or 18 and 60, right? So
right. Yeah.
It's elderly and not many males, and all women and children basically, and grandmothers, etc. But who are also women, of course.
We understand what you mean.
5 mothers and 5 children, plus another. Well, we had like 6 with 5, I think, in the end, or 5 and 5.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So, they knew where they were going. So we found one mother and child had to. We found housing for just one night because she knew where she needed to go the next day. But otherwise, they had destinations. And I think increasingly the trouble is, if people don't have a destination, it's where can we find where to put them, et cetera, where can they be received, and where can they actually feel comfortable and safe being received too. Because that kind of came up, even though we were housing someone through friends and through an organization of people and trusted people, they still didn't know us really. So she's like, well, where am I really going, And that's a whole other story that we encountered there. Also, it's like, making sure you can trust people that are going to take you somewhere. Yeah,
you have to give your details, phone number, and your ID.
It's still, they're doing their best, the authorities, if you will, to sort of make sure that people are not getting kidnapped, tricked, etc. But it's still pretty loosey-goosey, if you will. I mean, it's not an airtight process, I don't think.
That's an important point that Jonathan makes, that is that not all aid or buses that are there to transport people are necessarily acting in good faith. I know that there has been a problem with human trafficking down in Przemysl, where you've got people running buses out searching for attractive young women who are single, without children, ready to go to points unknown. And that's not a situation that needs to be happening, but it's there, and it's something that people need to be aware of and be careful of.
Jonathan,
Yeah,
you spotted a couple of people, didn't you, Jonathan? And,
yeah, well, to like, okay, well, you guys are sort of international. Tell me what these guys are. These guys that have been standing basically for 2 days with a phone number on these pieces of paper, looking into the room, the gymnasium filled with 200 cots, shaved heads, big weird goatees, like straight out of central casting for like suspicious characters, leather pants with, they were long enough to the heels of their shoes could step on them. And we were told that they'd been there a long time and they were looking to bring people to Germany and could provide housing. And so our connection at the center there and friends was like, so just give me your opinion. This seems suspicious. And we kind of turned around slowly. Don't look, don't look yet, but look. And it's like, oh my goodness, you're absolutely right. Those guys, it does not seem proper here.
I believe the word Nicholas would use is unsavory.
Oh, I would, and if we want to go French, I would say extraordinarily louche.
Yeah, also. Yeah.
Seedy and louche.
I'm glad that was sorted out, but it just highlights what Phil was making.
But they've been here for 2 days, just sort of waiting, standing and staring. And there were soldiers everywhere, there's police everywhere. And I think this is one of the things that we learned from some of the volunteers that we spoke to, is that they can do only so much and be suspicious and relay their concerns on and try to counsel the actual people that are staying there and the refugees. But without, that can only go so far if they don't have the backup of the uniformed authorities, really. And those guys, from what we can tell, of course, are doing their job, and they're being required right now to do a lot of many different things, wear a lot of different hats they probably weren't planning on, But there was sort of this sort of exasperation amongst the volunteers that are there almost 24 hours a day. They're sleeping there at night upstairs, and then they do the whole thing during the day. That eventually this sort of relief through volunteerism is going to, and you can see it as an analogy there. Like they can't really they can't enforce things there and actually get throw people out without the support of the uniforms. And then I think ultimately this whole effort will need to be supported not just by grassroots support and people and individuals coming together and helping. I mean, there will have to be something more from the government, et cetera, that can support this financially. I mean, you're feeding people. I mean, how much was gas? Gas was 800 zlotys there and back for one car. The rental's expensive. We fortunately raise funds to take care of this, but how much?
Yeah, you're working with other people, an Australian group and others, who've raised private funds for exactly this purpose.
It's like a GoFundMe, basically, for Ukrainians, right? I mean, that's. I mean, generosity and even just the simple need of others to be able to give is going to run out at some point, right? So I'm kind of gone off track here, but I started seeing the bigger picture. Eventually, we're going to figure out how to.
Well, I mean, the point is it's extremely emotional situation with a lot of people trying to be very focused, and that includes all of the refugees who seem to be extremely calm. The same thing one sees in Lviv, which Phil will be telling us about in the next segment after the break. But the thing that is so impressive is, as you've noted, with all the chaos that's going on, people are really keeping their heads and donating their time and their money as well when the inflation is terrible right now. Both with, and the oil price affects everything. It affects the cost of food because you have to move the food, right? You have to get the food out of the fields. That requires automated machinery. Then, so not only does the oil price go up, but the food price goes up because of all of those costs, right? Which we don't always think about. But we're thinking about it now. It's very much in the forefront of everyone's mind at this particular point. Yeah, so I want to thank you for telling us those things from your eyewitness account, fresh from the border yesterday. Phil's going to have a lot more about that. He's been in Lviv twice.
Got the other side story, right?
On the other side, and also in Przemysl and places down there, Korchova, at the crossings. And thanks to Nicholas for the NATO, very illuminating NATO brief. And to Harold for giving us the perspective from the Baltics, which many people say might be the next place, right, Harold?
Yes, sadly, but I think that's very doubtful because entering the Baltics means triggering Article 5. And I have absolutely zero expectation that Putin wants to launch some type of conventional war against NATO, because the only other possibility is a nuclear war. And in a nuclear war,
Thank you,
Russia
Harold.
is atomized along with many other places in Europe and even the United States.
Thank you very much. I'll let you you had the last word for this segment. Okay, everybody stay with us. We're going to change a couple of people in the studio and maybe have someone else join us from Krakow on Skype if we can get them. And we'll see you in the next segment after the break.